The courtroom was dead silent except for the sound of my heart hammering against my ribs. Judge Patricia Morrison held the inheritance documents in her weathered hands, her eyes moving between me and the man in the expensive suit who claimed my great-uncle Samuel Campbell had never intended to leave his dairy farm to some worthless kid from the state reformatory. Charles Cruz, the lawyer representing my uncle's business partner, leaned back in his chair with the smug confidence of someone who had never spent a night wondering if anyone in the world gave a damn whether he lived or died. I was 18 years old, sitting in a courtroom 300 miles from the only home I had ever known, fighting for a piece of land I had never seen that belonged to a man I had never met. The irony was not lost on me that after years of being told I was nothing, that I would amount to nothing, that nobody would ever want me, I was now fighting to prove I deserved something that someone had actually chosen to give me. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. I need to know there are people out there who understand what it feels like to fight for your place in the world. The judge cleared her throat and I snapped back to the present moment, to this courtroom that would decide whether I walked away with a future or walked away with nothing, just like I always had before. Let me take you back to where this all started, because the story of how I ended up in that courtroom begins in a place that most people drive past without thinking twice about. The Riverside Youth Correctional Facility sits on 43 acres of scrubland outside Bakersfield, California, surrounded by chain link fence topped with razor wire. It is not the kind of place that prepares you to inherit anything except more disappointment. I had been at Riverside for 2 years when the letter arrived. 2 years of waking up at 5:30 every morning to the sound of Jeremy Ross, our unit supervisor, banging on the metal doors. 2 years of institutional food, mandatory group therapy sessions, and educational programs designed to teach us basic life skills like how to fill out job applications and how to open a checking account. Skills for people who were expected to fail. The other residents called me Charlie, though my real name is Charles Cruz Jr. I never told anyone the junior part because that would mean explaining about my father. And Charles Cruz Sr. was not someone I wanted to claim any connection to. He had been in and out of prison since before I was born, and the few memories I had of him involved the smell of cheap whiskey and the sound of my mother crying in the next room. My mother, Gloria Evans, had died when I was 14. Cancer, the doctor said, though I always suspected it was really a broken heart that killed her. She had tried her best to raise me alone, working double shifts at a truck stop diner to keep us in our one-bedroom apartment. When she got sick, there was no family to take me in, no aunts or uncles or grandparents who stepped up to say they would give me a home. The state became my guardian, and after a series of foster placements that did not work out, I ended up at Riverside. The letter was addressed to Charles Cruz Jr., which should have been my first clue that something was different about it. Under the mail we got at Riverside was from social workers or court officials, and they always used our case numbers rather than our full names. This envelope was cream-colored and heavy, with my name written in careful cursive script. I was sitting in the common room when Jacob Taylor, the mail clerk, handed it to me. The return address said Samuel Campbell, attorney at law from a town called Millbrook that I had never heard of. My first thought was that I was in trouble for something, that maybe some crime from my past had finally caught up with me. My second thought was that it had to be a mistake, that this Samuel Campbell person had meant to write to some other Charles Cruz Jr. who actually mattered to someone. I almost threw it away without opening it. But something about the weight of the paper and the care that had been taken with my name made me curious. I found a quiet corner and tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead and a smaller sealed envelope with my name written on it in different handwriting, shakier and older. The letter from Samuel Campbell was brief and formal. He regretted to inform me that my great-uncle, Samuel Campbell, had passed away 3 weeks earlier. He had left specific instructions that I was to be contacted immediately upon his death. The smaller envelope contained a letter that my great-uncle had written to me personally, along with information about an inheritance that he was leaving to me. I read that paragraph 3 times before the words started to make sense. Great-uncle, inheritance, me. I had never known I had a great-uncle. My mother had rarely talked about her family, and when she did, it was usually to mention how they had cut her off when she married my father. I had grown up believing that I was completely alone in the world, that when my mother died, Every connection I had to anything resembling a family had died with her. The letter from my great-uncle was written on plain white paper in the same shaky handwriting that had addressed the envelope. It was dated just 2 months before his death. Dear Charles, it began, I know you do not know me, and I regret that I never had the courage to reach out to you while your mother was alive. Gloria was my sister's daughter, and I loved her dearly, but I was a proud and stubborn man who let family politics keep me from doing what was right. I learned about your situation through a private investigator I hired to find you after Gloria passed. I know you have been in the system for 4 years now, and I know that you are scheduled to age out soon with nowhere to go. I also know that you have been told many times that you are worthless, that you will never amount to anything, that nobody wants you. I want you to know that none of that is true. I am leaving you my dairy farm in Millbrook. It is not much by some standards, but it is 160 acres of good land with a house, a barn, and everything you need to make a life for yourself. The farm has been in our family for 3 generations, and it breaks my heart that it has been failing in recent years because I am too old and too sick to run it properly. I do not expect you to become a dairy farmer overnight. I do not even expect you to keep the farm if that is not what you want to do with your life. But I want you to have choices, Charles. I want you to have a place to go when you leave that facility. And I want you to know that you come from people who worked hard and built something with their hands. There will be people who tell you that you do not deserve this, that a boy from the reformatory has no business inheriting good land. Do not listen to them. You deserve this because you are family, and family takes care of family, even when they have never met. The letter was signed simply Uncle Samuel, and at the bottom he had added a postscript. The farm needs work, but the bones of it are good. John Wood, who runs the feed store in town, will help you if you ask him. He is a good man who knew your great-grandmother. I sat in that corner of the common room for 2 hours reading the letter over and over until I had memorized every word. Other residents walked past me, some stopping to ask what was wrong because I guess I looked like I had seen a ghost. In a way, I had. The ghost of a family I never knew existed, reaching out from beyond death to offer me something I had never dared to hope for, a place to belong. The legal process of claiming my inheritance took 6 weeks. Samuel Campbell, the lawyer, who turned out to be no relation to my great-uncle despite sharing his name, had to work with the state to get permission for me to leave Riverside early. There were forms to fill out and hearings to attend, meetings with social workers who wanted to make sure I was not being taken advantage of by some elaborate scam. I understood their caution. Kids like me were easy targets for people who wanted to exploit us. We were so hungry for any kind of connection, any promise of a better life, that we would believe almost anything. But the more Samuel Campbell explained the situation to me, the more real it became. My great-uncle had indeed owned a dairy farm in Millbrook, California, a town of about 800 people in the Central Valley. He had never married and had no children of his own. His will was clear and legally binding. Upon his death, the farm and all its assets would pass to his great-nephew, Charles Cruz Jr., currently residing at Riverside Youth Correctional Facility. The opposition came from Jeremy Ross, my great-uncle's business partner, who owned the adjacent property. Ross had been buying milk from my uncle's farm for 15 years and had apparently expected to be able to purchase the land when my uncle died. He had even made an offer to the estate, assuming that there was no family to inherit. When he learned about me, Ross hired Charles Cruz, a lawyer from Fresno, to challenge the will. Their argument was that my great-uncle had been suffering from dementia in his final years and was not competent to make decisions about his estate. They claimed that he had never mentioned having a great-nephew and that his decision to leave the farm to a juvenile delinquent was evidence of his diminished mental capacity. The insult stung, but it also made me angry in a way that felt clean and useful. I had been called worse things than juvenile delinquent, but something about hearing it in a legal context, as if my past mistakes disqualified me from deserving anything good, lit a fire in me that I had not felt in years. Samuel Campbell assured me that we had a strong case. My great-uncle had been examined by a doctor just 3 months before his death and had been declared mentally competent. He had also consulted with 2 different lawyers before writing his will, and both had testified that he knew exactly what he was doing. But legal battles take time, and I was scheduled to age out of Riverside in two weeks whether I had somewhere to go or not. That was when Sandra Ward stepped in. Sandra was the social worker assigned to my case, a woman in her 50s who had been working with kids in the system for over 20 years. She had seen enough young people age out with nowhere to go to know how quickly things could go wrong for them. Sandra arranged for me to be released into the temporary custody of Samuel Campbell while the inheritance dispute was being resolved. It was an unusual arrangement, but Samuel had offered to let me stay in his guest room and work in his law office while we waited for the court to make its decision. I left Riverside on a Tuesday morning in March with everything I owned in a single duffel bag. 2 changes of clothes, a pair of work boots that the state had provided, the letter from my great-uncle, and a photograph of my mother that I had managed to keep through all my various placements. Samuel Campbell picked me up in a blue Honda Civic that had seen better days. He was a thin man in his 60s with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He did not say much during the 3-hour drive to Millbrook, but he did not seem uncomfortable with the silence either. As we drove through the Central Valley, I watched the landscape change from urban sprawl to farmland. Miles of flat fields stretched out on both sides of the highway, broken up by irrigation canals and clusters of farm buildings. The mountains were visible in the distance, hazy and blue in the afternoon light. Millbrook turned out to be the kind of small town that people either love or cannot wait to escape. Main Street was 6 blocks long, with a feed store, a diner, a post office, and a few other businesses that looked like they had been there since the 1950s. The houses were mostly single-story ranch-style homes with large yards and pickup trucks in the driveways. Samuel Campbell's office was in a converted house on a side street, with a wooden sign in the front yard that read, Campbell Law, established 1987. His secretary, Deborah Morgan, was a woman about my mother's age who greeted me with a warm smile and offered me coffee and homemade cookies. That first week in Millbrook was strange and wonderful in ways I had not expected. Samuel gave me a desk in his office and taught me how to file legal documents and answer the phone. Deborah treated me like a nephew she had not seen in years, asking about my interests and making sure I ate enough at lunch. For the first time in my life, I was around adults who seemed genuinely interested in my well-being without being paid to care about me. But I was also anxious to see the farm. Every day that passed without visiting, it made it feel less real, like maybe I was just dreaming the whole thing. Finally, on Friday afternoon, Samuel suggested that we drive out to take a look at my inheritance. The farm was about 10 miles outside of town, down a county road that wound through fields of almond trees and grapevines. We turned into a gravel driveway marked by a weathered wooden sign that read Campbell Dairy, established 1942. My first glimpse of the property was both better and worse than I had imagined. The house was a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, painted white but showing its age with peeling paint and sagging steps. The barn was enormous, built from red wood that had faded to a rusty brown, with a metal roof that had patches of rust but looked structurally sound. What struck me most was how quiet it was. After years of living in institutional settings where there was always noise, always people talking or doors slamming or televisions playing, the silence of the farm felt profound. I could hear birds singing and the wind moving through the trees, but underneath it all was a deep, peaceful quiet that I had never experienced before. Samuel had the keys to the house, and we spent an hour walking through the rooms. The furniture was old but well-maintained, and everything was clean and organized. My great-uncle had clearly taken care of the place, even as his health was failing. In the kitchen, there was a note on the counter addressed to me. Charles, the note said, I hope you will find some peace here. The refrigerator is stocked, and there is firewood on the back porch. Make yourself at home. This is your home now. That night, I stayed in the farmhouse for the first time. Samuel had offered to let me continue staying with him and until the legal issues were resolved. But something about being in my great-uncle's house, surrounded by his things and his presence, felt important. I needed to understand what I was fighting for. I made myself dinner from the food he had left for me and sat on the front porch as the sun set over the fields. For the first time in my life, I was completely alone by choice rather than by circumstance. There was no one telling me when to go to bed or wake up, no one monitoring my behavior or evaluating my progress towards some institutional goal. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I found my great-uncle's journals in his bedroom, stacked neatly on a shelf next to his bed. He had been keeping daily records of the farm operation for over 30 years, noting everything from milk production to feed costs to the weather. As I read through the most recent entries, I began to understand the scope of what I had inherited. The farm had 23 dairy cows, down from a peak of 45 in the early 2000s. Milk prices had been declining for years, while feed costs had been rising, and my uncle had been struggling to keep the operation profitable. His health problems had made it difficult for him to maintain the equipment and facilities, and he had been considering selling the herd and leasing the land to a larger operation. But he had also written about his hopes for the future, his belief that with younger hands and fresh energy, the farm could be turned around. He had researched organic certification and direct marketing strategies. He had plans for renovating the barn and upgrading the milking equipment. Reading his journals, I realized that my inheritance was not just land and buildings. It was also his dreams, his vision of what the place could become with the right person caring for it. The next morning, I walked the entire property, trying to see it through his eyes. The pastures were overgrown in the places, and some of the fencing needed repair. The barn had equipment that looked like it had not been used in years, and the milking parlor needed updating. But the bones of the operation were solid, just like he had said in his letter. I was standing in the barn looking at a tractor that probably dated back to the 1980s when I heard a truck pull into the driveway. Through the open barn door, I could see a man in his 50s climbing out of a pickup truck with John Wood Feed and Supply painted on the side. John Wood turned out to be exactly the kind of man my great-uncle had described. He was tall and lean with calloused hands and a quiet way of speaking that made you want to listen carefully to everything he said. He had known my great-uncle for over 20 years and had been buying feed for the farm since John took over the business from his father. We talked for over an hour that morning. John told me stories about my great-uncle, about his reputation as a fair and honest man who treated his animals well and always paid his bills on time. He also did not sugarcoat the challenges I would be facing if I decided to keep the farm running. The dairy industry was changing, John explained. Small family operations like my uncle's were being squeezed out by large corporate farms that could produce milk more cheaply. The regulations were becoming more complex and expensive to comply with. The profit margins were thin, even in good years. But he also saw opportunities. There was a growing market for locally produced, sustainably raised dairy products. Consumers were increasingly interested in knowing where their food came from and how it was produced. A young farmer with energy and modern marketing skills could potentially make a go of it. The conversation with John gave me hope, but it also made me realize how much I did not know. I had grown up in the city and had never been around farm animals except for a few field trips to petting zoos. I knew nothing about dairy farming, nothing about business management, nothing about the dozens of skills I would need to make the operation successful. That afternoon, I called Samuel Campbell and told him I wanted to fight for the farm, not just because it was legally mine, but because I wanted to try to fulfill my great-uncle's vision. I wanted to prove that a kid from the reformatory could learn to do something meaningful with his life. The court hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Charles Cruz, the lawyer representing Jeremy Ross, had filed a motion to have my great-uncle's will declared invalid. They were arguing that his decision to leave the farm to me was evidence of mental incompetence, and that the property should be sold and the proceeds distributed to his creditors. Samuel Campbell spent the weekend preparing our case. We had medical records showing that my great-uncle had been mentally competent right up until his death. We had testimony from other lawyers confirming that he had understood the implications of his will. We had his journals, which demonstrated clear and rational thinking about the future of the farm. But we also had to deal with the elephant in the room, which was me. Charles Cruz was going to argue that no reasonable person would leave a valuable piece of property to a juvenile delinquent they had never met. He was going to paint me as an unworthy recipient who would probably sell the farm and waste the money on drugs or other destructive behavior. Samuel and I spent Sunday afternoon going over my testimony. He coached me on how to answer questions about my time at Riverside, how to explain my mistakes without making excuses for them, how to demonstrate that I had learned from my experiences and was ready to take responsibility for something important. The hardest part was talking about my mother. Samuel warned me that Charles Cruz might try to use my family history against me to suggest that I came from bad people and was destined to follow in their footsteps. I had to be prepared to defend not just myself, but her memory as well. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly yellow. Judge Patricia Morrison was a woman in her 60s who had been on the bench for over 20 years. Samuel had told me that she was known for being fair but tough, someone who did not tolerate nonsense from either side. Jeremy Ross was there with his lawyer, sitting at the plaintiff's table and occasionally glaring in my direction. Ross was a heavy-set man in his 50s who looked like he had never missed a meal. He owned several thousand acres of farmland and had a reputation as a shrewd businessman who did not like to lose. Charles Cruz opened by arguing that my great-uncle's will was the product of a confused and isolated old man who had been manipulated by stories about a great-nephew he had never met. He painted a picture of Samuel Campbell as someone whose judgment had been compromised by guilt and loneliness, who had made an irrational decision that would result in a valuable piece of agricultural land being wasted. Then he turned his attention to me. He described my criminal record, my time in foster care, my history of behavioral problems. He suggested that I was exactly the kind of person who would squander an inheritance, that I had no understanding of the value of hard work or the responsibility that came with owning land. It was brutal to sit there and listen to my life being reduced to a series of failures and bad decisions. But it was also motivating. Every word he spoke made me more determined to prove him wrong. When it was Samuel's turn, he presented our evidence methodically and calmly. He showed that my great-uncle had been mentally competent and had made his decision after careful consideration. He read passages from my uncle's journals that demonstrated his hope that a young person could bring new life to the farm. Then Samuel called me to testify. I had been nervous about this moment for days, but when I stood up and walked to the witness stand, I felt surprisingly calm. I thought about my great-uncle, about the letter he had written to me, about his belief that I deserved a chance to prove myself. Samuel asked me about my plans for the farm, and I told the court about my conversations with John Wood, about my research into organic certification and direct marketing. I talked about my willingness to learn, to work hard, to honor the legacy that my great-uncle had entrusted to me. Then Charles Cruz had his turn to cross-examine me. He asked about my criminal record, about the incidents that had led to my placement at Riverside. I answered honestly, acknowledging my mistakes but explaining how I had learned from them. He asked about my family history, about my father's criminal record and my mother's struggles. That was when I got angry. I looked Charles Cruz directly in the eye and told him that my mother had been the hardest working person I had ever known. I told him that she had sacrificed everything to try to give me a better life, that she had worked herself to death trying to keep us afloat. I told him that if he wanted to judge me based on where I came from, he should judge me by her example, not by my father's failures. I told him that my great-uncle had seen something in me that was worth investing in, and that I intended to prove him right. I said that I understood the value of hard work because I had watched my mother do it every day of her life, and that I was ready to do whatever it took to make the farm successful. When I finished speaking, the courtroom was quiet for a long moment. Judge Morrison looked at me with an expression I could not read, then looked at the lawyers. She said she would take the matter under advisement and issue her ruling within a week. That week was the longest of my life. I stayed at the farm, spending my days walking the property and reading everything I could find about dairy farming. John Wood stopped by several times to check on me and to share more stories about my great-uncle. He also introduced me to some of the other farmers in the area, people who had known and respected Samuel Campbell. I began to understand that this was not just about me inheriting a farm. It was about whether I would be accepted into a community that valued hard work, honesty, and taking care of the land. These were people who judged you by your actions, not your background, but they also expected you to prove yourself before they trusted you with anything important. On Friday afternoon, Samuel Campbell called to tell me that Judge Morrison had reached her decision. We were to appear in court the following Monday morning to hear her ruling. I spent that weekend in a state of nervous energy, unable to concentrate on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. I cleaned the farmhouse from top to bottom, repaired a section of fence that had been bothering me, and organized my great-uncle's tools in the barn. Keeping my hands busy was the only way I could keep my mind from spinning out of control. Monday morning came gray and cloudy, with the threat of rain in the air. Samuel picked me up at 8 o'clock and we drove to the courthouse in relative silence. I could tell he was nervous too, though he was trying to hide it for my sake. The courtroom was more crowded than it had been for the hearing. Word had gotten around town about the case and several local farmers had come to see what would happen. I recognized John Wood in the back row, along with Deborah Morgan from Samuel's office and a few other faces I had seen around town. Judge Morrison took her seat and called the court to order. She looked at both legal teams, then at me, before beginning to speak. She said that she had carefully considered all the evidence and testimony presented to the court. She had reviewed my great-uncle's medical records, his journals, and the testimony of the lawyers who had helped him prepare his will. She had also considered the arguments about my background and my fitness to inherit such a valuable piece of property. Judge Morrison said that while my past was certainly troubled, she had been impressed by my testimony and my obvious commitment to honoring my great-uncle's wishes. She noted that the law did not require inheritors to be perfect, only that they be the rightful recipients of a legally valid will. She ruled that my great-uncle had been mentally competent when he wrote his will, and that his decision to leave the farm to me was rational and legally binding. She dismissed Jeremy Ross's challenge and ordered that the property be transferred to me immediately. I felt like I could not breathe for a moment. After months of uncertainty, after years of being told I was worthless, I was now the legal owner of 160 acres of good farmland. I was somebody who mattered, somebody who had been chosen. The next few months were a blur of learning and hard work. John Wood became my unofficial mentor, teaching me about feed schedules and milk production and equipment maintenance. I enrolled in extension courses through the local agricultural college and spent my evenings reading about sustainable farming practices and business management. The physical work was harder than anything I had ever done, but it was also satisfying in a way that surprised me. There was something deeply rewarding about caring for the animals, about seeing the direct results of my efforts in their health and productivity. When I got my first milk check, for an amount that seemed impossibly large after years of having nothing, I understood why my great-uncle had loved this life. But the real transformation was not financial. It was about belonging somewhere, about being part of a community that valued the same things I was learning to value. The other farmers in the area gradually accepted me as one of their own, offering advice and assistance when I needed it, including me in their conversations about weather and markets and the future of agriculture in the valley. Karen Williams, who ran the local diner, started saving me a piece of pie when I came in for coffee after the morning milking. Brenda Sanchez, who worked at the bank, helped me set up accounts and taught me about agricultural loans and tax planning. Jacob Taylor, who delivered feed for John Wood, became a friend who I could call when I needed help with heavy lifting or just wanted someone to talk to. For the first time in my life, I was not just surviving, I was building something. 5 years later, I am writing this from the kitchen of the farmhouse that is now truly my home. The Campbell Dairy is thriving, with a herd of 35 cows and a growing market for our organic milk and cheese. I have renovated the barn, upgraded the milking equipment, and built a small processing facility where we make artisanal dairy products that sell at farmers markets throughout the Central Valley. But more importantly, I have built a life that my mother would be proud of and that honors the faith my great-uncle showed in me. I have learned that family is not just about blood relations. It is about the people who choose to stand by you, who believe in your potential even when you do not believe in it yourself, who help you become the person you are meant to be. The reformatory was wrong about me. I was not worthless. I just needed someone to see past my mistakes to the person I could become, and I needed a place where I could prove myself through honest work and dedication. I think about my great-uncle often, especially when I am sitting on the front porch in the evening, watching the sun set over the fields that he loved so much. I wish I could have met him, could have thanked him in person for the gift he gave me, but I hope that somehow he knows that his faith was not misplaced, that the farm is in good hands, that his legacy is secure. I also think about all the other kids who are still in the system, who are being told that they are worthless, that they will never amount to anything. I want them to know that those voices are lying. Everyone deserves a chance to prove themselves, to find their place in the world, to discover what they are capable of when someone believes in them. If you are watching this and you have ever felt like you did not belong anywhere, like nobody wanted you or believed in you, I want you to know that your story is not over. There are people out there who will see your worth, who will give you opportunities to grow and succeed. Sometimes those people are family members you never knew you had. Sometimes they are strangers who become family through shared work and mutual respect. The important thing is to never give up on yourself, even when everyone else has. Keep working, keep learning, keep believing that you deserve good things in your life. Because you do. Oskamao. I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Tell me about the people who believed in you when you did not believe in yourself. Tell me about the moments when you realized that you were worthy of love and respect and opportunity. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. And do not forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your place in the world. Your worth is not determined by where you came from or what mistakes you have made. Your worth is determined by who you choose to become and how you choose to treat the gifts you are given. Make them count.